thought maybe it was kids.
Or kids watching TV?
Okay, well, we are now live. Thank you for your patience.
Okay. This is the Senate Appropriations Committee meeting. We're taking testimony in the FY 2022 budget from the Agency of Natural Resources. For people who are listening, we apologize for the delayed start. We had technical difficulties and some of us were waiting to be let in for about 10 minutes. So that is the reason for our delay. And we have with us as our first item on today's schedule is from the Central Office of the Agency of Natural Resources. We have Secretary Moore, who's with us, and other staff if you want, and then other departmental staff. So Secretary, I'm going to have you introduce the staff you have with you today. And then if you have a document that you're sharing, we can obviously screen share. As you probably know from this committee, we want to really just have you go through the highlights. There are many in an agency, a lot of changes or internal service charges, et cetera. We understand them. We don't need to get into that level of line by line presentation of the budget, but really want to hear the highlights, any initiatives, how you are feeling in terms of updates with some of the initiatives that you have currently underway, including the climate change work, the plan, as well as clean water, which we can't forget about as well. So with that, I'm going to let you start however you wish. And if there's a document, then Chrissy will let you co-host whoever is going to put the document up.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having me here today. There are two other members of the central office staff that have joined me this morning. Emily Byrne, who I think is a familiar face to all of you, who's the agency's Chief Financial Officer. And then a new face, Maggie Gendron, who started as ANR's Deputy Secretary back at the beginning of January. After having that position sit vacant for about 10 months, I am absolutely thrilled to have Maggie on board as part of the team. In addition, both this afternoon and I think there's some additional testimony scheduled for Friday, each of the commissioners from the agency's 3 departments will come on in turn to speak in more detail about department budgets. But I thought I'd start today by providing just a high-level overview of the agency's FY22 Governor's Recommend budget. And then we can talk a little bit more about some of the initiatives you spoke to. And in particular, I think how they tack and tie to a number of the governor's recommendations for one-time funding.
Okay.
So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that now.
Not quite yet.
All right.
Now we can.
Fantastic.
Oh, good. This is what we like, Cliff Notes for budgeteers.
Well, perfect. And I have Emily to thank for helping pull this together. So as you can see, the budget for the agency sugars off where roughly about half of the agency's 600 full-time year-round staff, but about 2/3 of our overall budget flow to the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Forest and Parks. Each receive between $25 and $30 million of annual appropriation and have somewhat smaller staffs, at least year-round staff. What's not reflected in this total is the fact that we generally grow by about 400 seasonal positions each summer, the vast majority of whom are responsible for the ongoing operation of our network of 65 state parks. ANR's central office is very small and in fact has gotten considerably smaller over time. It used to be where both the HR and IT functions of the agency were located. But at this point, with the formation of DHR and more recently the Agency of Digital Services, it is my staff, a small accounting group and administrative services group that Emily manages, as well as our enforcement and litigation section and our office in policy and planning, which leads the agency's engagement in Act 250 and Section 248 proceedings. The budget for the central office itself is just about $5 million. And on top of that, we also receive and work with the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation to distribute the payments in lieu of taxes for agency held lands. In terms of our FY22 budget, we're facing the sort of traditional upward pressures, salary increases in internal service funds, as you'd noted, Chair. And the way we are addressing these budget pressure offsets is by some continued reliance on vacancy savings. This is agency-wide. We've also shifted several positions around within the agency to address new or emerging priorities. DEC is reducing their overall headcount through attrition and vacancies by 2. And then there are 3 additional positions from within DEC and 1 from within FPR that are being transitioned to the central office to administer or to support agency level priorities, including the implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act and work we are engaged in and accelerating around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We continue to utilize our special funds to the greatest extent possible, recognizing we also need to manage them in a way that is sustainable and believe we have achieved those dual goals. I may pause here because I think the other slides I have actually probably do a better job at getting at most of the things listed on this list, but would be happy to answer questions before flipping over to a different document if you'd like.
Any questions? I can't, obviously, it's hard to see the committee with the document up, but I think it's pretty straightforward in terms of how you're taking existing staff and reallocating based on where the workload is the greatest, as you're talking about. Special funds, we continue to be concerned, obviously, for Forest, Parks and Recreation. The fees that are generated are a very important source of revenue, and it's been a while since those fees have been increased. So part of the need for some of the budget pressure is coming from the fact that those revenue streams have not only been increased, but have been impacted by COVID, which we've just taken care of if we can get our budget adjustment passed. So
Yes.
Unless there are there further questions, we can just keep going. We're particularly interested in the one-time investments.
Sure. And I've started right there. I'm going to bury the lead a little bit. I do want to Commissioner Snyder, I'm sure during his presentation will speak in more detail to the Parks Fund. We did raise Parks fees, I believe, just a year and a half ago right now. And most of the challenges we are experiencing currently, or many of them, are a direct result of COVID, both refunds we've issued and declines in ski lease revenue. And our ski lease revenue comes in as a percentage of the total receipts attributed to the state-owned lands. And the total receipts for ski areas, as you might anticipate, are way down this year. And that's why there is a $2 million one-time request related to the parks that's in addition to the money sought during budget adjustment to address the refunds that we ended up issuing last summer.
Okay, so you think the fees were raised in FY20?
Either FY19 or FY20 during my tenure, though.
Okay.
Okay.
No, go right ahead. I'm just looking. I don't see any hands up.
Okay. So just at the highest level, the FY22 A&R budget represents an increase of about $16.7 million. The largest ticket item in that list is $10 million of special fund spending authority for a one-time transfer to the Environmental Contingency Fund. And so when we get to the end, where I will spend a little time on the governor's proposed investments of these one-time monies, that will come up again. This is the fund we use to pay for emergency environmental response when there isn't a responsible party immediately apparent. Probably the most significant recent usage of the ECF was in our response to the PFAS crisis in Bennington. This is a fund that receives a tax on hazardous waste transfer or hazardous waste generation. And over time, the use of hazardous materials in the state of Vermont has decreased, which is great news from one perspective, but has resulted in smaller and smaller revenues directed each year to the ECF. As you may recall, the General Assembly allocated some of the VW settlement funds to the ECF about 3 years ago right now. And this would restabilize or shore up the ECF for a period of years to come. And Commissioner Watt can speak to this in a bit more detail. The other piece, though, that's included in that $10 million transfer is money for PCB testing in schools. And I can talk again about that a little bit more in detail when we get to the one-time requests. The next item on this list, the $1.2 million interdepartmental transfer, is we are working to consolidate our legal services from each of the departments to be a team in the central office. This will allow us to more efficiently and effectively allocate legal resources across the 3 departments, and also provides, frankly, some career paths for our legal staff. So this is budget neutral from the perspective of the agency, but does change the interdepartmental spending authority.
So Secretary, just to be clear, these are not Assistant Attorney General positions. These are staff attorneys for the agency.
Correct. We have all of our own attorneys on staff at ANR. The next $4.3 million is in special funds and federal pass-through funds, so largely grant and contract programs, including a reflection of an increase in the Clean Water Fund revenues for the coming year. There's about an $800,000 change or upward pressure in state parks operating costs, and then about a $400,000 upward pressure in agency costs across all funds. Of this total increase, just over $123,000 is actually a general fund increase, with the rest being borne by special funds or federal funds. I also thought it was worth flagging.
Although isn't the source of the 10 million? I thought that was off the general fund one-time list initially.
It is, and maybe I can let Emily speak to that. We weren't 100% sure how best to represent that. This is the 123,000 is the change to our base budget.
Okay, that's all I want to know is, yes. So your base budget is essentially flat.
Correct.
Okay.
And just to keep in mind that a significant portion of the agency's overall budget is passed through grants and contracts, the most significant of which would be our state revolving fund loans, which are the low interest or no interest loans that we offer to municipalities in support of water and wastewater improvement projects. So that represents a really significant overall portion of our budget.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Starr, did you have a question?
Well,
You can,
yeah.
well, we heard Senator Starr clear his throat. I'm not sure. Did you have a question, Senator Starr?
Well, I'm wondering if you back up, Julie, to the previous slide, is that minus 0.4% or 123 less than last year's?
No,
General
that's just
fund?
an unfortunate choice of bullets, Senator Starr. It should that dash is the bullet that PowerPoint generated for me, not a negative sign.
Yeah, because otherwise it would look like you had a decrease and an increase.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
Thank you.
No, I'm sorry about that.
but
Well,
as you can see, a 0.4% after you deal with internal charges and stuff, that's basically,
Yeah, 0.
yeah. It's not profligate spending, so to speak. But this shows probably the DEC, this is where you really get into the kind of the pass-through. So it looks
correct.
out of all the departments, that's where it would appear, I
Yes.
would think primarily.
Yes, and if you look at the sort of the size of the DEC stacked bar, you can see that the green, which represents contracts, and the lighter blue, which represents our grant and loan programs, make up more than half of their budget overall. And then the other departments, it's fairly consistent then with staffing levels, frankly, the level of salary and benefits and our operating expenses. This is just another way to display how that budget, how our budget works out over the sort of the different types of funds that we use. The agency does receive a significant amount of federal funding. It's roughly a third of our budget most years. The general fund represents a little less than a third of our budget overall, and then a variety of different special funds make up the balance. These include things like the Clean Water Fund, the Permit Fund, the Parks Fund, but also some special funds like the Petroleum Cleanup Fund that have very targeted and specific uses. And then thought I'd just touch briefly on the one-time investments in the governor's budget. There are 6 one-time investments that hit the agency's budget directly, and then 3 additional ones I just want to flag because they are so central to our work. And as you had alluded to in your opening remarks, Chair, they also tack and tie with the commitments under the Global Warming Solutions Act. So the first of the governor's recommends is a $25 million investment in brownfields remediation. This money is actually shared across the DEC and ACCD budgets. $14 million would be slated to come to DEC, and an additional $11 million would go to the Department of Economic Development and the Agency of Commerce. VTrans is another important partner in our work around brownfields remediation and trying to create the economic redevelopment opportunities that these projects often present. This would be work that would be performed over a 3-year period. And some of it is it's important to show that we have the resources to make these ongoing commitments to these complicated and expensive projects to inspire the kinds of redevelopment activities we're looking to see. The next of the one-time initiatives is VORREC grants. These are the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. These are grants that we have been able to issue in very modest form over the last 2 years to the tune of $100,000 to $200,000 a year. They have been exceedingly oversubscribed and well received, and this is an opportunity to dramatically expand that program. Commissioner Snyder can speak to that in a bit more detail, but we are anticipating it would also be an opportunity to help promote some economic development activity along the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail corridor as that's being built out and coming to fruition. But also there are demands, frankly, statewide for these types of resources to help communities engage in outdoor recreation.
Julie, I'm not clear on what you want with LVRT because I thought what this would include other than the completion of the trail, which is being done through the capital bill and the transportation money. I assume this must be access improvements would be where this money would potentially help.
Or if communities were looking to build sort of adjoining facilities, recognizing that the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail is coming and there may be opportunities to sort of amplify the impact that could have in a local community with another strategic investment in an outdoor recreation asset.
Okay, so somebody had said, oh, there's $5 million available for the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, and that could help with the railroad station in Danville. Would that be the $5 million somebody thinks might be available to be a funding source?
It could be.
I haven't got it.
The governor specifically identified that he would like opportunities related to the rail trail to be part of what is eligible under this VORREC grant program.
Well, there's so many 5 million pieces of funding between not just in your agency, but throughout the governor's proposal. So it's hard to know when people say 5 million, exactly what may be referenced here, but I just thought I would ask, maybe it would come, people are thinking it might come under that.
I expect that might be the case. And speaking of 5 million, that is the amount proposed for the next initiative, which is trails and access improvements. I look at this as building on what I think is a wildly successful effort that the Departments of Forest and Parks and Fish and Wildlife engaged in earlier this last calendar year with CARES Act funds to both address and make repairs to some of our most loved outdoor recreation assets, as well as improve the accessibility to a range of Vermonters. We are anticipating a portion of this money will also be made available to private trail groups to perform maintenance and repairs on their trails as well. The next line is the funding for the Environmental Contingency Fund that I had noted at the beginning. Approximately half of that money would be set aside for PCB testing in schools. We are still working on some of the specifics around that initiative, but are anticipating there are about 300 schools statewide that are likely to require this testing as a result of the age of their construction, and that an average cost for testing a school is about $15,000.
Senator Bruce?
Oh, I can't hear you, Senator.
He's muted.
Sorry about that. I'm just wondering, and we'll flag for another day. I'm hoping to get consideration at several levels of the difference between the state's PCB standard and the federal government's. And it seems to me if we radically expand testing, which I believe we should be doing, we're going to immediately run into that question everywhere, as we have in Burlington. And it's angered parents and it's split parents, some of whom believe it's okay to go back into the school because many of the rooms meet the federal standard, but not the stricter Vermont standard. So my question generally is your agency doing anything along those lines to revisit the delta between the two standards? And if so, can you tie in with our Natural Resources Committee as you do?
So the standards themselves, in this case, it's actually an advisory level and not a standard or established by the health department. And we are having those conversations between the two agencies, since we are largely responsible for the remediation based on the standard they set. Because this is a health advisory, it generally is followed by a site-specific toxicological evaluation to determine whether or not sort of a higher number produces the health-related concerns. That the 15 is a screening value that we use to identify places that need a further look. We've certainly heard the concern expressed, and I think there isn't quite as much distance between our standard and the EPA standard. Once we deploy the site-specific evaluation, but that is an area of active work and discussion between ourselves and the health department, as well as with the Senate Natural Resources Committee.
I also would say
you.
that our Health and Welfare Committee has an interest in this as well, because it's a health standard, and the chair, Senator Starr, made reference to the difference in the standard, and our Health and Welfare chair, who has a background in this area, felt that the federal standard was outdated and there were limitations on using it as opposed to what the state recommendation is. So we've got actually, I guess, several committees looking at what the standard should be. But I'm going to also just alert you that the question really becomes one of, is this the right use of general fund, or should we be looking at, there's a lot of money coming in to our K through 12 system. And I know the House is working on a bill that would really look at assessing our school buildings and our educational infrastructure in terms of health. And it's more than just air quality or radon or lead, or sometimes it's septic, et cetera. And so I think just to let you know that you've got this testing right now, but the thought is rather than going through in this ad hoc, well, let's test for this particular risk and then let's go back and test for this or that, that we should be doing a statewide assessment of the infrastructure based on the age of the building, have established criteria in terms of the risks that are assessed in each building, and look at it more comprehensively. And then the ultimate challenge is testing is only the first step. It's how you finance the remediation. So just to let you know that this proposal here is actually linking into a much larger conversation about the health of our school buildings. What is that need, and how can we, in fact, recognize the fact that if we test, then there, in some schools, is going to be a need for what can be fairly expensive remediation.
Yes. That's a very important conversation, and recognize that larger conversation is going on.
Yeah, so I may, the 5 million for testing, we may look into something that comes into a different funding stream, but that's yet to be determined. But that's more of a heads up for the committee in terms of other discussions going around in the building, and as it relates to this specific testing money for the PCB testing.
Senator Kitchell, Senator Starr has a question.
Oh, well, I can't see him, and he doesn't have his hand up. So Senator Starr, I only can see Senator Westman, Senator Baruth, and Senator Ballin.
Well, they're the important ones anyway, so that's.
Well, Bobby, all you have to do is speak up, and because your voice is quite recognizable.
Well, I don't like to interrupt. No, I was just wondering, did Julie say that one of the criterias for testing was a recommend and the other is a standard, or did I hear that wrong?
So the recommend, if I'm recalling my words correctly, so there are certain ages of construction materials where PCBs are known to be present. So we would be targeting our testing to that segment of sort of the school asset class, which is largely, I believe, buildings constructed between 1950 and 1980. Then the standard that the health department has in this instance is actually an advisory level, the 15 parts per billion for PCBs. And what they have in place is a framework where if a sample result comes back in excess of 15 parts per billion, they then conduct a site-specific evaluation and are looking at factors, I believe, that include the type and duration of exposure people would be likely to have based on the kind of space it is. It matters if it's a hallway versus a classroom versus maybe a small office or guidance office, you could imagine. And so they do that work then following an exceedance of the 15 standard.
So could you tell us what is the federal standard?
I can look into that and get back to you. My understanding is it depends on the circumstance, and it actually ranges from 20 parts per billion to, I believe, 600. But I can't really speak to it in any more detail than that, but I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah, that it would be good to know, because sometimes we in the legislature get carried away with numbers and we think, well, we're only lowering it by 5. But if you look at the difference between 15 and 20, that's a 20%, 25% difference. And if we're going to spend millions and millions of dollars, we better get our act together and understand the differences here and what are the consequences of each. So that would be good if you could get back to us.
I think Senator Westman, maybe you can confirm, A&R has been taking testimony on this, and I know Health and Welfare has been taking testimony in terms of making a recommendation. Could you just speak to that?
Yes, we have, we met with Health and Welfare, the two committees together, and I think Chris and Ginny are talking about this, and where where we wanted to come down on that.
Okay. In
Did you
terms of
talk-
reconcile.
Did you
Uh,
talk about the difference not being only 5, but 25%?
I can't really speak, Bobby, to where Ginny and Chris will want to go with this and where the committees will come down yet. But clearly we talked about what the standards were and where they are and where we should move.
Did you compare that with other states? Or, I mean, how do we know where we should be if we don't have something to measure it by?
Well, that's going to be, I would think, the work of the committees to do that.
Well, knowing how that goes, I can tell you how I would perceive it to go, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah, well, I think that probably the policy committees are going to have to do the first cut on it. And look at the whatever the data, the science and whatever. I'm just saying that, you know, the testing, regardless of whatever agreed upon standard for this or for radon or for lead or whatever, you know, that has to be agreed on. But in this case, the question is whether we do, you know, hazard by hazard, you know, the problem du jour, or do we take a more comprehensive and universal assessment approach toward our, knowing that if you've got a building after 1980, maybe what you're screening for is not going to be for PCBs because that doesn't fall into that that age bracket. But there's a lot of work to be done on that, and so I'm just alerting people that there'll be further discussions as we move along. But I'm going to suggest we keep going on your graph here. So we probably are over time as it is, but Secretary, you want to
Sure.
keep going through your chart here?
I will. Just a few more items there. Next up is the transfer to the Parks Fund. This is in addition to the transfer that was included in our budget adjustment request. This is more specific to what we are anticipating in terms of reduced ski lease revenue this winter season as a result of a reduction in skier visits, as well as some additional costs, I believe, associated with COVID for operating the parks next spring. And we'll let Commissioner Snyder speak to that in more detail. Another piece of the one-time proposals is phase 2 of what we're calling our permit navigator. This is work that was begun with CARES Act funds, trying to create, or in a service of creating an online portal to allow Vermonters to identify what permits they're going to need for a particular project and initiate the permit application process while we were remote. But we looking forward to building that out further and believe it has great value, both in the current remote work environment, but also long-term for Vermonters. And then just wanted to flag.
Well, that's Secretary. Will this fund the creation of this this portal so that people have only one point of entry to know what permits are needed? Well, the 1.8 get the portal completed, or is this a first phase of money that is part of a longer term plan?
This is the second phase. The portal is available and can certainly prompt Commissioner Walk to at least give a screenshot view of it to you all on Friday. This is just further expanding its functionality. So from the user's perspective, it currently has this ability to screen and identify what permits are necessary. This part is starting to work on making direct connections to some of our other permitting databases, so that the information auto-populates and saves both the user and frankly our staff time and effort and ensures that data transfer occurs.
Okay. All right, well, we can talk to him a bit more. I'm just, sometimes we've got projects that have year 1, year 2, year 3. Some are like a self-contained software package, and so you're saying this is like phase 2, but are there other phases that you're going to be coming back and asking for funding at some point?
I would let Commissioner Walk speak to that. We've intentionally broken these things so that they work sort of where the work stops. I think there's always opportunities for improvement and expansion, but there is a logical break point at the end
Okay.
of this phase of the work.
All right, thank you.
Mhm. And then those last 3 initiatives are ones that fall outside ANR's budget, but I think have particular importance when it comes to the implementation of the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that includes a $25 million weatherization package, a $5 million package for electric vehicle incentives, and then a $10 million package for community clean solar. We know that both transportation and buildings are the 2 largest sources of greenhouse gases in Vermont. Taken together, they represent nearly 2/3 of our overall emissions. And so these 3 investments in that space are important to achieving the really aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements contained within the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Okay. And I realize you're putting them here just to connect them back, and that's good. What is really helpful, though, is are there, and maybe there are, we haven't gone through this, but for every single one of these governor's initiatives, is there a brief description, the amount of funding, the number of people impacted, what will be the benefit? In other words, weatherization, 25 million sounds good. How much would it be apportioned? Who would benefit? What are the estimated number of houses to be weatherized? The community clean solar, I have 10 million. Where did that come from? Other than we had money, so we're allocating it out. How many Vermont communities are estimated would that serve? Have you seen any sort of summary descriptions of, the purpose? What would be the number of Vermonters impacted? What would be, what the money would get, and how would we measure it? Are there documents like 1-pagers that go with every one of these initiatives?
Yes, there's a package of white papers, and I can share that with you, and
That would be very
highlight
helpful.
the pages that these specific initiatives are
Okay,
on, but each has one.
All right, so that would be helpful to know. And I don't know, maybe Senator Westman, maybe you've seen some of those white papers in ANR?
I haven't yet.
Okay.
No.
All right. Well, it's particularly helpful. So if there is, if you can provide them at least for the one-timers that you're referencing here, that would be great. Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yes, Senator Sears.
On the 25 million for weatherization, does anybody have a total that we put into weatherization in the last couple of years? Seems like we continually, I'm not doubting the value of weatherization. I'm just wondering how much money we're putting in and how much we follow that money, where it's going. And then I have a question about the 5 million for electronic vehicles, which is great. That's fine. Has anybody figured out how we're going to pay for our roads?
So maybe starting with the second half, my understanding is there is a docket in front of the Public Utilities Commission asking that very question, Senator Sears, about appropriate compensation for electric vehicles. I know that that's a topic that's near and dear to the hearts of the Agency of Transportation, as it obviously has significant implications for their budget, and is an area of ongoing discussion, both in Vermont, but also regionally and nationally as electric vehicles become more widely used. In terms of weatherization, I believe some of the figures you're requesting are in the white paper, and we'll forward that to the committee for its review. I do think probably having Sean Brown or somebody else from the Department of Children and Families that is largely the lead agency for the state on weatherization would allow them to speak to more of the specifics of your questions, because I am not in a position to answer those right now.
Also, I think what is really helpful too is weatherization is not one and done. I've heard that you have to, the weatherization impact is sort of time limited. So that would be interesting to know what the data show on that, because we've had a weatherization program since the 80s, and so it's sort of what is that life cycle of those weatherization investments as well. We do get an annual report from DCF every year, OEO through OEO, in terms of the number of homes weatherized, the estimated consumption reduced, and so forth. But that's year by year, so it's kind of helpful to get in the aggregate. Also, the treasurer did have, I think it was a low-cost loan program, because people, if the weatherization investments can save money on fuel consumptions, then with those savings, you can pay off the loan and then still have the residual benefit. But I believe the experience was that there was a band of income just above weatherization eligibility where people were not taking advantage because of their economic circumstances. So there's, and I haven't, and I don't know whether we've got in the past maybe a report in terms of what the take-up rate was in relative to those loans, but maybe that's in the white paper as well. Because I do understand some of this money would go out to households whose incomes are higher than those used for the weatherization programs operated by the Office of Economic Opportunity. So
right, the intention
okay.
would be to target some moderate income households in
Yes.
addition to low income households.
Yeah. Okay. Senator Starr, Senator Westman. After that,
I thought I read somewheres that we were up around $100 million a year in weatherization. Does that sound right?
not through state funding. Not through state funding.
Well, with federal money and state money and.
Bobby, I think that number is really off. We have some education to do in the Senate side. It's on my radar screen. Actually, we've had quite a bit of questions about weatherization. The governor has proposed a fair amount. I know that there is interest in both the House and Senate in doing a significant investment. And so we've got to do a little bit of a tutorial for ourselves. But no, there hasn't been that level of investment in weatherization. And we have thousands and thousands of homes and families who would like to take advantage of it. And we're not just limited by the funds, but also by the people trained to be able to do the work. So multi-pronged approach.
Off the top of my head, I think in the aggregate, because we pulled some money from some other places. It was at the time the House was proposing to put an additional increase on the tax of home heating fuels. And we put together in total with money coming from a variety, about 18 million. That's what I remember.
Because it does work. I know I've had quite a few constituents.
Yeah, I know.
And it really makes a difference.
But the 18 million is really to assist. And then there's been some discussion around how Efficiency Vermont could supplement their work in areas on home heating costs. Well, so Senator Westman, you had a comment?
So and I've been trying to get Joint Fiscal to come into natural resources and give us a breakdown of this. But the 18 million is for training for people to do the work, and there's a lot of money in there for training for people to do the work, and the other half goes into weatherization. But counter to that, and I have to ask the question of the secretary, about 45% of all of the carbon emissions are from transportation related. And if you look at a household, the average household, 56% of the total energy they use is in their vehicles. And only 34% is for thermal heating. And if we're going to break the back of moving people that are particularly low income and making a choice between their carbon use and helping them improve their economic situation, their cars are vital to move us to another step. And this is completely weighted towards weatherization. Why is that?
That is
Easy.
a great observation, Senator Westman, in terms of the relative impact. I think part of the challenge is one of the tools that are currently available to us in each of these spaces. Our weatherization toolbox is fairly robust at this point. As folks have alluded to, we have literally decades of experience doing this work. And frankly, the considerations in the investments in weatherization go well beyond the greenhouse gas reduction potential. They also, weatherization projects improve the livability and the health of the residents in the homes in which they take place. And there's an economic recovery component too, in that there are good jobs to be had doing weatherization work. Your points around the importance of electric vehicles, though, in meeting our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements are also spot on and frankly not lost on me. And we are going to continue to plug away, forgive the pun, at the work in this space in the years to come. But currently, there aren't the quantity of electric vehicles. And in some ways, some would argue there aren't the quality, at least that would be matched to Vermont's climate and roads out there just yet. That said, we know we need to continue to make progress in this space, both in terms of encouraging Vermonters who can purchase those vehicles new to do so that we continue to build out what will ultimately become a used car market, as well as invest in the infrastructure needed to support electric vehicles that is really so central to the kind of adoption and build out we know we need to see in the years ahead.
Well, I have to say that if you're someone working in the Community Action Agency, which is around the state, which are doing a lot of the weatherization, they have very little tools to help somebody get into a more efficient car. And I have to say to you, in my county is not unusual. If you're in the northern part of my county, you drive to the southern end of my county to work, and you're probably driving a junker and it's not reliable. And if they can't get a reliable vehicle, they're going to be on assistance programs from the state.
Well, then maybe you're raising the question, is this the right allocation? And should it be 25 million for weatherization and only 5 or whatever it is for transportation?
That's exactly what I'm bringing up, because if I'm looking at a household and 55% of their emissions that are coming out of that household are from their transportation, and only 34% is coming out of their house, it would say to me, environmentally, we should be doing more with cars. And it's hard for me to stand back and say that we're doing enough when those are the numbers.
Well, that's a longer discussion. I'm just looking at the clock. We're way behind schedule. We were supposed to be on Commissioner Snyder at 2:00, and it's now 2:30. So obviously the allocation and the governor's one-time proposal is going to go through quite a bit of examination, and maybe the allocations get adjusted for different considerations. What it is a balance, because weatherization certainly gets into other financial demands in terms of the cost of energy to that household, quality of life, health conditions, and the list probably goes on. So there's going to be a lot more discussion around what is the right balance and how because they're competing goals in a variety of areas. So, Senator Ballant, you had a question. Otherwise, I'm going to
No, I just wanted, you brought it up, talking about the health concerns. It's a big aspect of a benefit of weatherization that perhaps is not as obvious, but you've mentioned it. I think we should move on. I agree.
Okay, so Secretary Moore, have we gotten pretty much through the central office?
We have. I was going to
Okay.
have Emily Byrne walk through the ups and downs quickly, but to the extent you want to do that
And
on
if
your
you
own.
tell me, if most of what you're talking about is interdepartmental transfers or off the one-time list, that will be a separate conversation. And if we look at your base budget, I would say if you are essentially flat, there's probably not, I don't mean to diminish the importance of it, but it's probably not a whole lot there that is unusual. I would say it's pretty pretty trimmed down.
It is, and it is the interdepartmental transfers make it look like there's some.
Yeah. And any of the one-time money just distorts it. So that's, we need to make it clear your base funding is really unchanged, literally unchanged. And it's really how we want to look at this one-time money and how we make the investments and how we allocate across many competing possible needs. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move on to, I'm sorry.
Can I jump in and just add one little detail in case it comes up? So the agency budget.
No, I want to know, Emily, is it regarding the common chart of accounts? If
no,
not,
I don't work there anymore.
You can't speak to that.
Not today. I'm not
No.
prepared. I will say the agency budget overall is relatively flat. If you look at the central office budget on its own, it does look like there is a $200,000 increase. That's because with the lawyers moving and with a few other things going on, there's a lot of net neutrals going on around across the agency. I just wanted to, when you get down the road, when you are going through the whole budget at the end and it looks like there's a big increase in the central office budget, it's a lot of administrative moving stuff around. Just want to throw that out there.
Oh, well, gee, I didn't, my impression was that you really had skinned the cat. So I am.
We did it by taking money from the other departments.
Well, but you're moving staff around as well. So I understand some of that is net neutral. It's just where it shows up within the agency.
Yep. And then there's our natural increase in the pilot, or, we purchased land over the past year. So there's an increase in the anticipated pilot payment. But other than that, happy to answer questions offline or another time.
Okay. Otherwise, I'm going to move on now to Commissioner Snyder. You're next. Now, but the other question that I have is Lewis Porter was supposed to be on in 2:45. So Chrissy, did we tell Lewis we'll reschedule?
I have not done that yet, so I was just waiting to hear. So would you like me to go ahead and do that? So there's no one's feeling pressure?
Well, let me ask Michael, how long is your testimony? Can you give us
I can do it quite quickly. I think hearing your interests and where they lie and the fact that other than a couple of key pieces, it's relatively stable. I can cover it pretty quickly and touch on the parks and the one time.
Okay, so maybe we'll do a quick run through, and then if people have more questions, we can follow up. I think this is Alice's section of the budget, so she's probably made copious notes, and we'll get back on behalf of the committee. So as long as Lewis is still there, we have until 3. We're going to see if we can get at least the high points of the two departments in before we break around 3 o'clock.
Sure. Works for me.
So it's all yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Madam Chair, and greetings all. For the record, Michael Snyder, Commissioner, Forest Parks and Recreation. Happy to join with you here. And by way of introduction, I also have Kristen Freeman along, our Director of Finance and Admin Services. And in case I get into trouble here. And my thanks to Kristen, who's just done a ton of work over the last year or so with so many different pieces and a lot happening. So for the fiscal 22 governor's recommend for FPR, as I say, it's generally with a couple of very notable exceptions that I want to drive you to immediately. It's pretty straightforward with internal service funds increases, normal operating cost increases, some of these transfers to the center office, et cetera. But really the two big issues relate to the Parks Fund and the COVID implications of operating the parks this year. I'm glad that we had a chance to come in and talk about the Budget Adjustment Act request for $1.2 million in refunds to help cover our refunds. Because that gave us a chance to explain the park season, what went on, what didn't, the compressed season, reduced offerings. So I'm assuming you're pretty well aware of that. It won't be a surprise to you, but the upshot is increases. We look ahead to next year for the parks operating season, and looking ahead right now for an operating plan that can allow us to continue to operate in a healthy and safe way. 21 was difficult, and so we basically zeroed out the parks fund. That's in the restatement of the 21 budget. And so that was a big piece of why we didn't want to go into the red and why we came for budget adjustment for the refunds. That's all 21 related, and that sets us up here coming into 22, doing okay as we look forward to the season ahead, but are making a request for $2.05 million in one-time general fund transfer to the Parks Fund for two pieces. One, as both the secretary mentioned, but one is $1.05 million for to cover what we estimate to be a 30% reduction in ski lease revenues this winter. You'll recall that 7 ski areas lease land from us throughout the state. And those lease payments range, they're around $3 million a year. They've been a little below, somewhat above in good years. And not really knowing how to budget, but knowing that this, owing to travel restrictions and density limitations, operating restrictions, et cetera, we expected the ski areas to do less business. So we weren't sure.
You're right, I think.
Yeah, and I was speaking with Ski Vermont the other day, and she indicated that she thought our 30% estimate actually was tracking pretty well with what they're seeing, a 30% reduction. So that's the 1.05 million. And as a one-time transfer request beyond our base budget. And the other is $1 million for parks operating that we have. Normally, we see $500,000 to $1 million in increased operating costs in the parks year to year. And this year, the big driver would be keeping our seasonal workforce of some 350 to 400 people, making their minimum wage increases happen, and keeping a separation between the grades of park attendants and park managers, so there's no compression there, so that there's actually steps for people to grow their parks careers. So that's the big story here, is the 2.05 million in one-time transfer from general fund to parks fund to kind of bail out the parks special fund and allow us to operate and stay level as we continue to look forward. I want you to know, I think I've spoken about it before, we're working with Department of Financial Regulation. They're doing kind of a benchmarking study of our revenue approach, our offerings, where do we stack up regionally and with other states? Is there revenue potentially left on the table? One area I'll give as an example is we've asked them to analyze the concept of dynamic pricing in the parks, much like you might see in airlines, where the price of a lean-to or a cabin actually reflects demand and supply. And so midweek, where we tend to be kind of slow, perhaps the price would be lower. Holiday weekends, where we're very busy, the price would be higher. So we've asked them to weigh in on this kind of credible benchmarking study for us. That's all looking forward to possibility of changing our fees, as you mentioned earlier, Senator Kitchell. But we're seeing this as, given the uncertainties of COVID, the impact of COVID, the role we'd like to continue to play in offering healthful recreating opportunities for Vermonters and their guests. That's where we stand, is kind of hold steady and make this request for the general fund transfer.
Okay, if we could just stop right there.
One-time stuff for recreation investment. I can talk about that separately.
No, I do want to talk about that. At least originally, Emily sent us a list of possible investments on the one-time list. We want to move a smaller spending bill out faster. And thinking behind it is some of the projects or proposals on the one-time list would lend themselves to an earlier start date. So some of the trails work or the VORAC money going out. The idea is maybe incorporating some of those proposals in a separate faster track spending bill, so that you could start the work, say in April or early May, and get advance on completion earlier in the season. So
Which is great.
we do have the list from Emily that she sent to us that would be possible candidates for an earlier release of funding. So I don't know, have you seen what Emily sent on your behalf?
I think the answer is yes.
I would say yes, even
Yeah.
if you haven't, Michael.
We have a lot of lists, we have a lot of projects, and we are aware of this idea that possibly there could be another spending authority that accelerated. And so we have all kinds. We have shovel-ready projects. As Secretary Moore mentioned, this is kind of stimulated by our experience with the CRF funds and a rapid deployment of contracts around the state in the fall. So we have stuff from that process. We learned how to do it. We know we can do it. We have a range of projects, scales, types, scopes, geographies around the state, some of which ready to go, some would take longer, and that would be helpful to get going on some.
All right, well, I'm glad you would find it helpful. So our goal is to take that propose the list of projects and see which ones we would want to move ahead faster. So
the only thing I might say about that, Madam Chair, is that that the list, from my perspective, the projects on that list that would be forest or parks, it could change. That's a list of the possibilities. And I think strategically, we might want to have another pass at which are the ones that move the needle, which ones. So I would just offer that I think it's offered as the universe of possibilities. It's a subset of the possibilities, actually. And if you want to get serious about identifying projects, I think we as an agency would be ready to come back in and further refine that list based on what we know.
Well, then I'm going to ask you to do that because, VOREC is on their state lands project and brownfield remediation, which is not in your wheelhouse. I hate that term, but I guess it works.
Sure.
If we were to take some of that funding and move it forward, can you identify projects out of that 5 million? Should we,
Yes.
if you gave me 2, I could really run and get some stuff out the door, or whatever the right amount is. That's what I need to have back. And that's something you and Emily and the secretary could work on in terms of out of those proposed lumps of money, what portion would you recommend being released earlier and for what purpose or project?
Right. So you have that. I think you have largely what you would need is the project being the list being not specific projects per se, but high level generalized approach to give you the types of projects. And that's great. I think you have enough to know those are the kinds of things we can do. But if there's more is needed, we can follow up with. I think from what I understand, you actually have a pretty good list of the types of projects we're talking about that would be good to accelerate.
I do, but I don't know. I'm not prepared to give you all 5 million for VOREC grants right now. So can you tell me out of
3
that?
or 4.
That would be, so that's that. I'm glad you mentioned that. So you have the 5 million in VOREC for VOREC community grants proposed. That's coming to FPR to go out to communities around the state in the VOREC grant process, which is, so we have a sense.
So maybe you don't want to split it up. You want all 5 million to go out and do it as one slug. That's what I need to know. Are any of them chunkable? Or would you, because they're going out in grants, you would want to do one grant advertising and consider all applications as a pack, at one time?
That's how we're thinking of the VOREC piece. The 5 million out would be, the VOREC steering committee is meeting Thursday to make some decisions about lifting the cap that we currently have. So kind of take the program to a bigger scale, put out an RFP across the state, see what comes in, and rank those projects according to the criteria, and then put out somewhere between 20 to 60 grants out around the state in a range of pretty big ones and a variety of smaller ones to meet community needs. That's the VOREC bucket.
It does, but I think it might vary depending, because we're not releasing all the brownfield money at one time. So I'm just saying, we need to have a better understanding. If you could move, if we pass this bill, could you move the VOREC money, the grants out and start the RFP process, say April 15th, as opposed to June 15th. That's what I'm talking about.
Yep,
So,
and I think we are. We've been considering this, and
Okay.
I think we're in a position to do it. We've
Okay.
got the program exists. We wouldn't have to start up a whole new thing.
Okay,
and
so I'm going to
push it
ask
out.
Emily, and on behalf of your earlier memo, which is kind of the big chunks of money, if you could look at which ones lend themselves, or would you have to do it as a package, which seems like, based on what the commissioners say, makes sense for the VORAC grants. Just, can you refine that, those requests, and which ones would lend themselves to a fast track or would
Sure.
justify the time sensitivity to do it? Brownfields, I don't see in the same way as spring construction necessarily, but okay, Senator Starr, and then I'm going to move
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
What about the trails and rec money? There's 5 million there. There might be some areas there that, and Michael, just send us 2 or 3 projects, and we don't need to talk a long time about it. Just send us 2 or 3 projects to get done.
Okay. And so the other 5 million in one time to the agency to be split through FPR, Fish and Wildlife, and some portion to go made as grants out to trail groups for private lands for recreational infrastructure. We are compiling lists. That's what I was referring to earlier. On state lands, we have lots of different scales and types of projects, and we could easily identify. We are actually working now on which ones would be ready to go now, which ones could we push out on an accelerated timetable, which are the other ones that are going to take a little bit longer, et cetera. So we have lots of, at FPR alone, we've got about $18 million worth of projects.
Well, you don't even have that much money, though.
Right. Well, my point is just to show there's plenty of work. It's really more about which ones are most appropriate for accelerated deployment, which ones will move the needle in which way out there in Vermont, right? So we have them, and we can report on it any which way.
All right. Well, Emily, you've got a sense of what we're looking for. If not, you can talk to Stephanie a bit more about what would lend itself, and do a little bit more refining to the memo that you sent earlier. Okay. Other questions of the commissioner. He wants 2.5 million for the Parks Fund, which seems to be pretty reasonable. And
2.05 actually.
What?
I'm sorry, 2.05.
2.05, I got it, 2.05. We won't forget the 0.05. Anything else that you want to bring to our attention this afternoon?
Kristen, I think, right, I just asked Kristen if I'm forgetting something key that we don't want you to miss, but I think it's pretty straight up. I mean, we're happy to meet with Senator Nitka to drill in further as might be necessary, as always, walk through the BDF, the ups and downs, but that's really drilling to what's the big change here. It's COVID relief for the parks, so we can get back on track.
Okay. Now, unless there are further questions for Commissioner Snyder, I'm going to, I'm assuming that we have Commissioner Porter somewhere, not on this screen, but somewhere. He's been
He's
admitted.
here. He's with us. Yep, he's in the room.
Okay. All right. So I'll start with Michael Snyder for now.
Yeah.
Okay.
See
All
you, Michael.
Thank you all. Take care.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to Fish and Wildlife. And your 2022 budget request. And obviously we want the highlights. Are there any one-times that fall into your budget area, Louis?
Yeah, so we have a fairly routine budget for you in the most part, and then a couple of items I'd like to address at the end that are, I guess, budget related quickly. But so we're requesting a just over $26 million budget. There are a number of changes in the ups and downs that I can go through with you if you'd like, or I can just give you the very high high level version of that, whatever the committee prefers.
Now, we're not going line by line and ups and downs. A lot of that is just, a matter of personnel cost, internal service charges, et cetera. So no, there's a
Sure.
lot of movement within a budget, but we really want the highlights of something substantial, either
Sure.
initiative with one-time money or something unique or savings. If you've laid off half the department to meet your budget work, we might want to hear about that, for example.
Sure, and I should say I have with me Steve Gomez, our budget and business office manager, so he can correct or add to this as well. Essentially, our budget is fairly routine. We are booking a number of vacancies to make the budget numbers work, and counting on those vacancy savings to make our budget work. We are planning on 5 vacancies across the department, 3 warden positions and 2 scientists. That reduces our costs by about $449,000 from what they would be otherwise.
How many wardens?
3 wardens and
3
2
wardens and 2 scientists?
Correct. Those will be not RIFs. They will be positions that are vacant through attrition. There are a couple of significant changes in this budget. One of which is an increase in our use of Great Lakes Fishery Commission money to work on fisheries and fisheries economy issues in the Memphremagog Basin. That's money that's come to us through the help and assistance of Senator Leahy. And we're using that money as directed, and that comes from Great Lakes Fishery. And then we are also ending or completing a major land acquisition project with wind power mitigation funds. And so you'll see what appears to be a decrease in our one-time land acquisition costs, but in fact, that just reflects the use of money that's been on our books for a while to complete that project.
So what land are we acquiring? Is there a proposed parcel?
There is. It's in the southern part of the state. It's the parcel is Glebe Mountain, I
Oh,
believe.
yeah, I thought we put money in a couple of years ago through VHCB for that.
We did, and this is completing our share of it using mitigation money from the wind tower projects for our share of that project.
Okay, okay.
And coming off our books, essentially. We're also proposing $120,000 for survey of use of access areas. We run about 200 access areas around the state. Periodically, say once every 10 years, we survey users to make sure that they are getting what they want and what they need from those. And so that's $120,000 cost out of our boat access area fund, I believe, to pay for that survey and make sure that we are operating and investing in those projects in those places the way that we would like to. In addition, there is the discussion about body cams and body, which I think this committee has already heard some about, and so I won't go into it unless necessary, but we are proposing funding for wardens to carry body cameras. That's actually in the one-time money proposed by the administration, I believe, and not baked into our budget.
No, that's correct. And but I heard that that your testimony around the acquisition of body cameras was, at least the way I heard it from the House, was that there were still many questions that needed to be addressed. We had put in language that said, here's the funding to acquire them, but there have to be protocols and training and so forth around the use. Now, we were kind of surprised. We thought the budget adjustment took care of it, but are you getting body cameras both in the budget adjustment and the 22 bill? Did the funding get split into the 2 bills, Louis?
The funding did get split, and that was really confusion caused by us, and I apologize for that. Essentially, we proposed sort of a stripped down version of body cameras which would have been a less complete version than the state police. And that we proposed that in the budget adjustment. As we discussed that with public safety and agency of administration and the agency of digital services, it became clear that we were likely creating problems for ourselves if we had statewide law enforcement officers with the same powers with different body camera systems. And so the reason that money is now split between the BAA and the regular budget is that the combined, those two pay for us to have the same system as VSP. So a total of 139,000. Our original proposal was for 45,000 only for a reduced system. Does that make sense? I mean, it may not make sense. Is that clear?
Well, I guess
doesn't-
you're showing
yeah.
why it was split into two. But I heard back from your testimony in the House, because we put the funding in. The governor had proposed it. The House did not include it in the BAA. We put it in because the position of the, obviously, Senate Judiciary has been unequivocal and in strong support of body cameras for law enforcement. And so I guess the House is going to add to our language around training, but I don't know whether it was intended or not, but it was sort of your use of the cameras was much more tentative. And it was like, why would the administration be proposing the acquisition of cameras if there wasn't a well thought out plan of how the departments that would be getting these cameras would be using them? So that's why I wanted to put.
I don't know. I have heard the same thing, and I don't know where that came up, because we have always been in support of body cameras, and it's always been our intent to use the same training and use procedures as state police.
Okay. And what about storage?
The full $139,000 includes storage for I believe it's the next 2 years, and it would be a $20,000 cost in the budgets beyond that for storage.
Okay. Senator Sears, you have any questions on that? Since obviously, I believe we're going to get a little bit more language back on the funding will
Well, I'm
remain.
sure we will. I think the administration is doing the right thing, and I don't know why we keep getting in the way of getting the job done.
Okay.
Just to be
think
clear, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I understand the concern to make sure that the policies are there, particularly when you turn it on and turn it off, because that's where most of the abuses have been. But whenever an officer is interacting with the public, that body camera should be on. It protects the officer as much as it protects the public.
Okay, well, yes, Alice.
So with regard to the protocol, with regard to use, are you doing that combined with the Vermont State Police as to, I mean, you have different missions, but I mean, is that how you're putting that together with them, or are you working on it separately?
Together. They are the lead agency in developing the policy. We certainly have input to make sure that works for the unique circumstances that wardens may encounter, but we are working through them to make sure the policy works for both entities.
And in the budget adjustment, when we put in the funding for the cameras, we made it clear that they cannot be used until that training and those procedures are in place for the department. So, and you're absolutely right. Consistent use and training is pretty important. And that's, so I think the money will still be there. The question is whether our language would be expanded upon, which probably is no surprise, Senator Sears. But thank you for clarifying and putting yourself on the record that the department supports the use of cameras, supports the acquisition, is prepared to do the training and support the implementation, and are working closely with the state police and to see that happen. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
So, there's one other issue in the budget I'd like to, actually, I'm sorry, two others I'd like to address if I could.
Yes.
One is the state recreation money that you were just discussing with Commissioner Snyder. That $5 million for access projects on state lands will be split in some fashion between our departments. And certainly receiving that money earlier would be beneficial in terms of getting projects underway and built this construction season. We are providing, or have provided, I guess, through Emily, a list for you. But in general, we would use that money to make sure that people can access public lands and waters. And so that would include upgrades and improvements to boat access areas. It would include upgrades and improvements to wildlife management areas in general, similar to the projects we did using that 1.6 million that Fish and Wildlife received from the CARES Act money, which we got out in the fall. And I think greatly improved the ability for people to access their land and water. And that would be our goal here too. Happy to give you more specifics on those projects, but in general terms, yes, it would be helpful to get it earlier. We can certainly, between the two departments, spend $5 million on it. And we're grateful for your consideration of that.
So what I would ask is, Emily, send us one combined, because it's all off that one-time list. So that would be helpful. Thank you. Other comments that you want to make, Louis? How's your
one more
baby?
thing.
Well, I want to
The
know,
baby
how's the
is great.
baby?
The baby is great. If she wasn't on a nap right now, I'd bring her in for the camera, but maybe given knowing that your time is tight. But one other issue I wanted to mention is we included in the budget request language on the bill back of Act 250 work by my department. And the short version of that is that there is existing bill back language in the statute, but it doesn't work for our department very well, or really at all. And therefore we are unable to recoup costs spent working on Act 250 projects. We have proposed as part of the budget a cleanup of that language and a new version of that language. Happy to go into more detail if you'd like, but I just wanted, since it is in your budget, I wanted you to know that was the origins of that and why we proposed that.
Okay, all right. Know that it is a use of staff resources, and so we'll take a look at that proposed language.
And
Okay.
we're proposing to streamline it in such a way that we could actually utilize that language, and would be grateful for your consideration.
Okay.
Great.
Other questions of Commissioner Porter? And you know, it's 3 o'clock and we managed to get everything in. Just shows you, huh?
Yeah.
If there are no further questions, we have about a half-hour break. So I'm going to suggest we go off